June of 1941. Across the vast expanses of Eastern Europe, the Wehrmacht stood poised on the edge of what many German officers believed would be their greatest triumph yet. Their tanks, which had swept through Poland in weeks and crushed France in a campaign that left the world stunned, were ready to unleash a new kind of war on the Soviet Union. The Panzer commanders gathered in their command posts, examining maps, discussing tactics, sharing cigarettes and quiet confidence. They had every reason to be optimistic. Their intelligence reports painted a picture of Soviet armor that seemed almost laughable. Outdated light tanks, poorly trained crews, obsolete designs that belonged to another era of warfare. The German tankers had faced the best that Britain and France could field and emerged victorious. What could the Soviets possibly have that would challenge the masters of mechanized warfare? The answer to that question would arrive with shocking brutality on the second day of Operation Barbarossa, and it would force Germany to completely rethink everything they thought they knew about armored combat. This is the story of how German mockery turned to respect, then to fear, and finally to a desperate scramble to rebuild their entire armored force. It's a story about technological surprise, industrial might, and the brutal realization that sometimes the enemy you underestimate is the one who changes the course of history. At the center of this transformation stood a single tank design, one that would go on to become the most produced tank of World War II and fundamentally reshape how every nation thought about armored warfare, the T-34. But to understand the magnitude of the shock that hit German tank crews in the summer of 1941, we need to first understand just how dominant they believed themselves to be. And they had good reason for that belief. The masters of Blitzkrieg. By the spring of 1941, the German Wehrmacht had established itself as the most formidable military force on earth. Their Panzer divisions had demonstrated a new form of warfare that left traditional military thinking in ruins. Poland had fallen in just over a month. Denmark capitulated in hours. Norway, despite British intervention, was subdued. The Netherlands lasted 5 days, Belgium 17, and France, the great military power that had fought Germany to a standstill in the trenches of World War I, collapsed in 6 weeks. The architect of much of this success was the Panzer Arm, and its most vocal champion was General Heinz Guderian. Guderian had pioneered the concept of concentrated armored formations operating independently, punching through enemy lines and racing deep into the rear to create chaos and collapse. His theories, once controversial, had been proven devastatingly effective on the battlefields of Europe. The Panzer crews who served under commanders like Guderian weren't just confident, they were certain of their superiority. Their equipment seemed to justify that certainty. The mainstay of the Panzer divisions was the Panzer III, armed with a 50mm gun and protected by frontal armor that, while modest by later standards, had proven adequate against Polish and French armor. Supporting them were Panzer IVs, originally designed as infantry support vehicles with short-barreled 75mm guns, but increasingly proving their worth in tank versus tank combat. Together, these vehicles had carved through enemy defenses with a combination of speed, coordination, and tactical brilliance that overwhelmed their opponents. The German tank crews had developed a professional pride in their abilities. They had mastered the complex choreography of combined arms warfare, coordinating closely with aircraft, artillery, and mechanized infantry. They had proven they could operate their vehicles with skill and maintain them in the field. They had outmaneuvered larger French forces, overcome superior numbers of British Matildas and French Char B1s through tactical cunning and better coordination. When German intelligence briefings described Soviet armor as consisting primarily of obsolete light tanks like the BT series and the T-26, the reaction among Panzer officers ranged from satisfaction to outright dismissal. One German report from before Operation Barbarossa described Soviet tanks as museum pieces that would pose no serious threat to modern German armor. The few officers who suggested caution were often brushed aside. After all, hadn't German tanks already faced supposedly superior designs and won through better tactics and crew quality? The T-26, intelligence reports noted, was based on a British design from the early 1930s. The BT tanks, while fast, were thinly armored and prone to catching fire. These were not the kinds of vehicles that would challenge the veterans of France and Poland. This confidence extended beyond just the tank crews. German anti-tank gunners had trained extensively with their standard weapon, the 37mm Pak-36. While some officers had expressed concerns about this relatively light gun's effectiveness against heavier armor, it had performed adequately in the campaign so far. Supporting these guns were the newer 50mm Pak-38s, just beginning to reach front-line units in small numbers, and of course the legendary 88mm flak guns that could be pressed into anti-tank service if needed. As the sun rose on June 22, 1941, over 3 million German and Axis troops surged across the Soviet border. Operation Barbarossa, the largest military invasion in human history, had begun. The Panzer spearheads raced forward, supported by waves of Stuka dive bombers and mechanized infantry. Within hours, hundreds of Soviet aircraft had been destroyed on the ground. Within days, entire Soviet armies found themselves encircled in vast cauldron battles. The initial successes seemed to confirm everything German commanders believed about their superiority. The first days. The opening phase of Barbarossa unfolded like a textbook demonstration of everything the Wehrmacht did best. Panzer divisions punched through Soviet defensive lines, exploited the breaches, and raced into the depths of Soviet territory. Massive encirclements at Białystok and Minsk trapped hundreds of thousands of Soviet soldiers. German tank commanders reported encountering exactly what they expected: waves of poorly coordinated Soviet tanks that seemed almost eager to throw themselves onto German guns. The BT series cruiser tanks that formed a significant portion of Soviet armor proved to be everything German intelligence had promised. Lightly armored, they burst into flames when hit by even modest anti-tank weapons. Their thin steel seemed designed more to keep rain out than shells. German after-action reports from these early engagements read with an almost casual tone, describing how 37mm guns punched through Soviet armor with ease, how single German tanks faced multiple Soviet vehicles and emerged victorious through better gunnery and tactics. The T-26 light tanks fared little better. These vehicles, based on British Vickers designs, carried adequate guns for infantry support but were woefully vulnerable in tank combat. Their riveted construction had a tendency to come apart under impact, sending deadly rivets flying through the crew compartment even when shells didn't fully penetrate. German gunners reported that hits to these tanks often resulted in catastrophic fires or ammunition explosions that tore the turrets from their hulls. For the German Panzer troops, these early days must have felt like a vindication of everything they'd been taught. Soviet coordination seemed chaotic at best. Radio communication appeared almost non-existent among Soviet tank units, with flags and signal lights being used for communication in situations where German crews would have been coordinating over their radios. Soviet tank formations would sometimes charge forward in uncoordinated masses, making them easy targets for German gunners who had trained in more disciplined, methodical approaches to engagement. But scattered among the wreckage of BT cruisers and burning T-26, some German units began encountering something different, something that didn't match the intelligence briefings, something that made even veteran gunners pause and recalculate their assumptions. June 23, 1941. The second day of Operation Barbarossa began much like the first. Panzer columns advanced along dusty roads, pushing aside Soviet resistance, destroying scattered tank units that attempted to slow the German advance. And then, on multiple sectors of the vast front, German crews started reporting encounters that didn't make sense according to everything they'd been told to expect. Near the Lithuanian border, a German anti-tank gun crew spotted a Soviet tank cresting a low ridge. Standard procedure: sight on the target, lead appropriately for the range, and fire. The 37mm gun cracked. The shell flew true, struck the Soviet tank squarely on its sloped front hull, and bounced away with a bright spark and a puff of dust. The crew reloaded, fired again. Another ricochet, a third shot. The tank continued advancing, apparently unconcerned with being hit by weapons that should have been lethal. Other units reported similar encounters. A German report from that day described the experience with an almost bewildered tone. Half a dozen anti-tank guns, fire shells at him which sound like a drumroll, but he drives staunchly through our line like an impregnable prehistoric monster. This wasn't supposed to happen. Soviet tanks were supposed to be thin-skinned, obsolete, easy prey for German weapons. This tank, whatever it was, represented something fundamentally different. As more reports flooded in from different parts of the front, a pattern emerged. Two new Soviet tank types had appeared, neither of which matched anything in German intelligence files. One was enormous, a heavy tank that some units designated KV, with armor so thick that even the 50mm guns on Panzer IIIs struggled to penetrate it. The other was a medium tank, lower and more compact than the KV but sharing its revolutionary characteristic: sloped armor that made German shells bounce away like stones skipping on water. The Germans had encountered the T-34 and the KV-1. At the beginning of Operation Barbarossa, the Red Army had deployed almost 1,000 T-34 tanks and over 500 KV tanks, concentrated primarily in 5 mechanized corps. German intelligence had completely missed these developments. The shock of encountering them in combat cannot be overstated. For tank crews who had grown accustomed to seeing their shells punch through enemy armor with satisfying regularity, the experience of watching round after round ricochet from sloped steel plates was profoundly unsettling. One engagement near Raseiniai in Lithuania became particularly infamous. A small group of KV tanks, possibly as few as 1 or 2, held up an entire German division for more than a day. The massive heavy tanks, weighing over 45 tons and protected by armor up to 90mm thick in places, simply absorbed punishment that would have destroyed any other vehicle on the battlefield. German anti-tank guns fired until their barrels glowed. Shells bounced off or shattered against the thick armor. The KVs methodically destroyed German vehicles, seemingly invincible. The T-34s proved almost as troubling. While not as heavily armored as the KV, these medium tanks combined several features that made them revolutionary. Their frontal armor, 45mm thick and sloped at 60 degrees, provided effective protection equivalent to roughly 90mm of vertical armor. Their 76.2mm guns could destroy any German tank at ranges where German weapons couldn't reliably penetrate the T-34's armor. Wide tracks gave them excellent mobility over terrain that bogged down German vehicles, and they ran on diesel engines, making them less prone to catastrophic fires than gasoline-powered German tanks. German commanders who encountered these tanks immediately recognized them as a serious problem. A lieutenant named Stupe reported hitting a T-34 5 times at ranges between 20 and 50 meters with armor-piercing rounds from his 50mm gun, with no noticeable effect. Other crews reported similar experiences. The standard German anti-tank weapons of early 1941 were simply inadequate. Fortunately for the Germans, the vast majority of Soviet armor they encountered in the opening weeks of Barbarossa remained the older, vulnerable types, and the T-34s and KVs that did appear were often squandered through poor tactical employment, lack of coordination, mechanical breakdowns, and insufficient training. The Soviet mechanized corps that possessed these advanced tanks lost most of them within the first 2 weeks of the invasion, the majority to non-combat causes like abandonment due to mechanical failure, lack of fuel, or inability to recover damaged vehicles. But the impression they made on German crews who encountered them was indelible. As one German officer put it, these weren't just better tanks. They represented a completely different philosophy of tank design. One that suggested Soviet engineers understood something about armored warfare that the Germans had missed. The revolutionary design. To understand why the T-34 shocked German tank crews so profoundly, we need to examine what made it revolutionary. This wasn't simply a question of having thicker armor or a bigger gun, though it had both. The T-34 represented a holistic approach to tank design that optimized several crucial factors, simultaneously in ways that Western designers hadn't considered. The most immediately obvious feature was the sloped armor. The Soviets hadn't invented sloped armor, but they were the first to make it the defining characteristic of a main battle tank's design. Every major surface of the T-34's hull and turret was angled. The frontal glacis plate, the most commonly targeted area in combat, sat at 60 degrees from vertical. This simple geometric arrangement had profound effects. When a shell struck sloped armor, it had to penetrate more steel than if it hit a vertical plate of the same thickness. A 45mm plate at 60 degrees forced an incoming shell to pass through roughly 90mm of steel. Additionally, the angle increased the likelihood that shells would ricochet rather than penetrating, especially if they struck at anything other than a perfectly perpendicular angle. German intelligence analysts who eventually examined captured T-34s in detail were struck by how this design philosophy permeated the entire vehicle. The turret wasn't just a box with a gun in it. It was a carefully sculpted shape designed to maximize protection while minimizing weight and manufacturing complexity. The hull sides were angled. Even the rear armor incorporated slopes where possible. This comprehensive approach to armor shaping was something German designers hadn't fully appreciated. The second revolutionary aspect was the track and suspension system. The T-34 rode on wide tracks, 500mm across, mounted on large road wheels. This gave the tank excellent ground pressure characteristics, meaning it could traverse mud, snow, and soft ground that would bog down narrower-tracked German vehicles. German Panzer crews learned, often to their frustration, that terrain that stopped their advance was merely an inconvenience to a T-34. The wide tracks also contributed to the tank's rough country speed and reduced wear on the running gear. The suspension itself, based on the Christie system, was robust and simple. Large road wheels with long travel suspension meant the T-34 could maintain speed over rough terrain that forced German tanks to slow to a crawl. This mobility advantage was particularly significant in the Soviet Union, where paved roads were rare and the seasons brought extremes of mud and snow that tested the limits of mechanized warfare. Then there was the engine. The V-234, a V12 diesel power plant producing 500 horsepower, represented another significant advantage. Diesel fuel was less flammable than the gasoline used in German tanks, reducing the risk of catastrophic fires when the tank was hit. The engine was also more fuel efficient, giving the T-34 excellent operational range. And its design, while requiring aluminum for certain components, could be mass-produced more readily than some of the more complex German engines. The main armament, a 76.2mm gun, was larger and more powerful than anything mounted on standard German tanks in 1941. The F-34 gun, that eventually became standard on the T-34, could penetrate German armor at ranges where German guns couldn't effectively reply. This gave T-34 crews a crucial advantage in engagement ranges, though this advantage was often squandered by poor optics and the two-man turret crew arrangement that forced the commander to also serve as gunner. And that brings us to the T-34's weaknesses, which were significant. The interior was cramped to the point of being claustrophobic. Vision devices were poor, making it difficult for crews to spot targets. The two-man turret meant the commander had to split his attention between commanding the vehicle and operating the gun, leading to slower engagement times compared to German tanks with dedicated gunners. Radio sets were initially so scarce that only command tanks received them, forcing other tanks to communicate with flags and hand signals. The transmission was notoriously difficult to operate, requiring tremendous physical effort to shift gears. But here's the crucial point that German analysts recognized when they eventually studied captured T-34s. Despite all its flaws, the T-34 got the fundamentals right in a way that German tanks didn't. It optimized for the factors that actually mattered in the brutal, grinding warfare of the Eastern Front. Crew comfort didn't matter much when you could have thicker armor instead. Complex optics didn't matter if your armor could shrug off enemy fire while you closed to point-blank range. Sophisticated fire control didn't matter if you could overwhelm the enemy through sheer numbers of adequately effective tanks. The T-34 was designed for mass production and mass employment. Its relatively simple construction meant it could be built quickly and in large numbers. Its robust design meant it could take abuse and keep fighting. Its diesel engine and wide tracks meant it could operate in conditions that paralyzed more sophisticated vehicles. And its combination of armor, gun, and mobility meant that even poorly trained crews could be effective if employed in sufficient numbers. When German technical officers finally had the chance to thoroughly examine captured T-34s in the autumn of 1941, their reports made sobering reading. The tank was crude in many ways, lacking the precision engineering and careful finish of German vehicles. But it was also brilliantly conceived for its intended purpose, and it could be manufactured at a rate that German industry couldn't hope to match while still producing all the other weapons the Wehrmacht required. Immediate responses. German tank crews, being practical soldiers concerned primarily with survival, didn't wait for formal policy responses to the T-34 threat. They began developing tactical countermeasures immediately, sharing lessons learned through informal channels and official after-action reports. The first and most obvious solution was to avoid frontal engagements with T-34s and KVs. If the frontal armor was impenetrable, shoot them from the side or rear. German crews became adept at maneuvering for flank shots, using terrain and combined arms tactics to force Soviet tanks to expose their more vulnerable side and rear armor. A 50mm gun that bounced off a T-34's glacis plate could punch through its side armor at close range. German anti-tank gunners learned to aim for specific weak points. The turret ring, where the turret mounted to the hull, was a vulnerable spot on all tanks. Track and suspension components could be targeted to immobilize the tank, after which it could be destroyed at leisure or bypassed. Close-range attacks from the rear, where engine decks and rear hull armor were thinnest, proved effective if infantry could get close enough. The most reliable immediate solution, however, was the 88mm flak gun. These anti-aircraft weapons, when pressed into anti-tank service, could penetrate T-34 and KV armor at ranges beyond which the Soviet tanks could effectively reply. But 88s were relatively scarce, heavy, difficult to move quickly, and primarily needed for air defense. Using them as dedicated tank destroyers was an inefficient use of limited resources. Some units received small quantities of tungsten-cored Panzer Granate 40 ammunition for their 50mm guns. This expensive rare ammunition could penetrate T-34 armor at close range, but supplies were so limited that crews were instructed to save it for crucial shots. The standard instruction was to get within 100 meters of a T-34, aim for the side or rear armor, and put the tungsten round where it counted. If you missed with your limited tungsten ammunition, you'd better have a fallback plan. On the industrial front, Germany began accelerating programs that were already underway. The longer 50mm KWK-39 gun, which had better penetration than the earlier KWK-38, was prioritized for installation in new Panzer IIIs. The Panzer IV, originally designed as an infantry support vehicle, began receiving long-barreled 75mm guns that could engage enemy armor at extended ranges. The new long-gunned Panzer IV, designated the AUSF F2, would prove to be a stopgap solution that bought Germany crucial time. But stopgaps weren't enough. Something more fundamental was needed. The Wehrmacht needed tanks that could match or exceed the T-34's capabilities. And that meant Germany needed to study the T-34 in detail and design new vehicles in response. The commission arrives. On October 4, 1941, General Heinz Guderian's 2nd Panzer Group suffered a sharp reverse near the town of Mitsensk, south of Moscow. Soviet forces, including well-handled T-34s under the command of Colonel Mikhail Katukov, ambushed German units in forested terrain that negated many of Germany's tactical advantages. The battle highlighted the T-34's mobility and firepower in a way that caught Guderian's full attention. Guderian, never one to mince words, immediately demanded an inquiry into the realities of tank warfare on the Eastern Front. In his initial reaction, he suggested the most straightforward solution: produce a direct copy of the T-34. Simply replicate the Soviet design and build it in German factories. After all, if the design was superior, why waste time trying to improve on it? Get German T-34s into production as quickly as possible and restore the balance on the battlefield. On November 20, 1941, a special commission arrived at Guderian's headquarters on the Eastern Front. This wasn't just a military inspection team. It included some of the most senior figures in German tank design and production. Ferdinand Porsche, whose name would become synonymous with German engineering, Oskar Hacker, director of the Steyr Corporation, Colonel Sebastian Fichtner, head of Department 6 of the Ordnance Directorate, Engineer Heinrich Kniepkamp, and high-ranking representatives from Krupp, Daimler-Benz, Henschel, MAN, and Rheinmetall. These were the men who would determine Germany's response to the Soviet tank threat. The commission examined captured T-34s in detail. They measured armor thickness and angles. They studied the transmission, the suspension, the engine. They test-fired the guns. They evaluated the manufacturing techniques. Their findings were simultaneously reassuring and troubling. Reassuring because the T-34 was indeed crude in many ways. The finish was rough. Components showed evidence of hasty manufacturing. Quality control appeared inconsistent. The design used steel alloys and production techniques that weren't particularly sophisticated. German engineers, with their emphasis on precision and quality, could certainly build something mechanically superior. Troubling because copying the T-34 directly, as Guderian had suggested, was impractical for several reasons. The diesel engine required aluminum components, and Germany had limited aluminum supplies that were needed for aircraft production. The steel alloys used in the T-34's armor, while not sophisticated, were different from German alloys, and switching would require retooling and could cause delays. Most fundamentally, German production lines were set up for German manufacturing methods. Retooling to produce direct copies of a Soviet design would take longer than designing a new tank that incorporated T-34 principles while using German components and manufacturing techniques. The Commission's report, delivered to German High Command in late November, made several crucial recommendations. First, immediate measures. Accelerate production of the new 75mm PaK-40 anti-tank gun, which could defeat T-34 armor. Upgrade as many Panzer IVs as possible with long-barreled guns. Increase distribution of tungsten-cored ammunition. Second, long-term measures. Develop a new 30 to 35-ton medium tank incorporating the T-34's key innovations. Sloped armor, wide tracks, high-velocity 75mm gun. Make it German in execution but Soviet in philosophy. Third, and perhaps most significantly, continue development of heavy tanks. The Tiger program, which had been underway before Barbarossa, took on new urgency. Germany would pursue a two-track solution, upgraded medium tanks to match the T-34 and heavy tanks to exceed it. The response to the Commission's report revealed deep divisions within German leadership. Some officers argued for pragmatism over perfectionism. Others insisted on maintaining German design standards. Hitler himself became deeply involved in the details, convinced that German engineering must produce superior solutions to Soviet designs. The Führer, according to his armaments minister Albert Speer, determined the monthly quota as well as the direction and scope of all production down to the last detail. Two design firms received contracts to develop the new medium tank. Daimler-Benz proposed a design that closely mimicked the T-34, with rear-mounted engine, sloped armor all around, and even a similar wheel arrangement. MAN proposed a more conservative design that retained a front-mounted transmission and a less radical approach to armor sloping. After months of development and evaluation, MAN's design was selected. It would become the Panther. But the Panther wouldn't be ready for combat until mid-1943. In the meantime, German tank crews would have to make do with upgraded versions of existing designs and hope that tactical skill could compensate for technical deficiency. Kursk, the Panther's debut. By the summer of 1943, the war on the Eastern Front had reached a crucial juncture. The catastrophic German defeat at Stalingrad had shifted momentum to the Soviets. But German forces had stabilized the front through a brilliant counteroffensive at Kharkov, led by Field Marshal Erich von Manstein. A large Soviet salient bulged westward around the city of Kursk, presenting what German planners saw as an opportunity to encircle and destroy massive Soviet forces, regaining the initiative in the east. Operation Citadel, as the Kursk offensive was codenamed, would be the largest deliberate attack Germany launched on the Eastern Front. And it would feature the combat debut of the Panther, Germany's response to the T-34. German planners believed the Panther would be the decisive weapon that would restore German armored superiority. The Panther looked formidable on paper. Weighing 44 tons, it mounted a long 75mm KWK-42 gun that could penetrate a T-34's frontal armor at ranges exceeding 2 kilometers. Its frontal armor, sloped at 55 degrees and up to 80 millimeters thick, made it effectively immune to the T-34's 76 millimeter gun at typical combat ranges. Wide tracks gave it good mobility despite its weight. In theory, it was everything German tankers needed. In practice, the Panther sent to Kursk was a disaster waiting to happen. The decision to commit the Panther to combat at Kursk was controversial from the start. General Guderian, who by this time had been appointed Inspector General of Armored Troops, strongly advised against using the Panther until its mechanical problems were resolved and crews were properly trained. Initial field tests had identified 45 major defects, including catastrophic issues with the transmission, final drives, engine cooling system, and fuel delivery. Panthers had a disturbing tendency to catch fire, with fuel leaks dripping onto hot engine components and igniting. But Hitler, convinced that the Panther was essential to the offensive's success, overruled these objections. Operation Citadel was delayed multiple times to wait for more Panthers to arrive at the front, giving the Soviets precious weeks to fortify their defenses around the Kursk salient. In the end, around 200 Panthers were committed to the offensive, concentrated in the 10th Panzer Brigade, assigned to XO8 Panzer Corps. The problems began almost immediately. During the rail movement to the front, 2 Panthers caught fire upon disembarking from their transport trains. By the morning of July 5th, when the offensive was set to begin, 16 Panthers had already broken down, leaving only 184 operational for the attack. The crews were largely inexperienced with the new tank, having received only minimal training. Radio procedures at battalion level were inadequate because the units had been ordered to maintain radio silence until the attack began, preventing practice. The offensive opened on July 5th with massive artillery preparation and waves of panzers advancing into the Soviet defenses. The Panthers, positioned in the vanguard, immediately encountered problems. The extensive Soviet minefields wreaked havoc on the complicated running gear. Engines overheated in the summer heat. Transmissions failed under the stress of combat maneuvering. Final drives, the components connecting the transmission to the tracks, proved particularly fragile. By July 7th, just 2 days into the offensive, the number of operational Panthers had dropped to 40. Some had been destroyed by Soviet fire, but the majority were victims of mechanical failure. Soviet anti-tank guns, mines, and artillery had claimed their share, but engine fires and transmission failures claimed more. The narrow spacing of the Panther's road wheels made track maintenance difficult and trapped mud and debris that could freeze solid in winter or clog the running gear in summer. When Panthers did work, they were devastating. The long 75 millimeter gun could kill T-34s at ranges where the Soviet tanks couldn't effectively reply. German crews reported engagement ranges of 2,000 meters or more, picking off Soviet tanks like target practice. But too many Panthers never made it to the fighting, stranded by mechanical failure or unable to be recovered when damaged because they were too heavy for standard recovery vehicles. The Battle of Kursk became the largest tank battle in history, with thousands of armored vehicles engaged across multiple sectors of the salient. The climactic engagement at Prokhorovka on July 12th saw over 1,500 tanks clashing at close range in choking dust and smoke. The Panthers that participated in this massive brawl fought well, but their technological advantages were negated by the close-range melee conditions and their limited numbers. By the time Hitler called off Operation Citadel in mid-July, citing the need to divert forces to meet the Allied invasion of Sicily, the Panther battalions were shadows of their former strength. Of the roughly 200 Panthers committed to the battle, fewer than 50 were still operational. The rest were destroyed, abandoned, or awaiting repair. The Panther's operational readiness rate throughout the summer of 1943 never exceeded 35%. The rush deployment of the Panther at Kursk represented a fundamental misunderstanding of what had made the T-34 successful. Soviet designers hadn't created a technological marvel. They'd created a design that could be produced reliably, maintained in the field, and employed in large numbers. The Panther, for all its technical sophistication, failed these practical tests. It was complex, difficult to maintain, and produced in numbers insufficient to make a strategic difference. Ironically, the very features that made the Panther superior in individual combat made it inferior as a war-winning weapon. Its complicated fire control and excellent optics meant little if the tank couldn't reach the battlefield. Its powerful gun was useless if the transmission failed halfway to the front. Its thick armor didn't matter if engine fires consumed the vehicle before it engaged the enemy. By late 1943 and into 1944, many of the Panther's problems were resolved. Improved manufacturing quality, better crew training, and design modifications addressed the worst defects. The Panther that fought in Normandy in June 1944 was a much more reliable machine than the one that debuted at Kursk. But by then, the strategic situation had deteriorated to the point where even a superior tank couldn't alter the fundamental mathematics of the war. The numbers game. While German engineers were perfecting the Panther and fielding ever more sophisticated tanks like the Tiger, Tiger II, and various assault gun variants, the Soviet Union was doing something far simpler, but ultimately more decisive, building T-34s at a rate that boggled the imagination. The story of Soviet tank production during World War II is one of the great industrial achievements in military history. When Germany launched Operation Barbarossa, the sudden advance threatened to overrun the Soviet Union's main tank production facilities. The Kharkov factory, where the T-34 had been developed and initial production had taken place, lay directly in the path of German armies advancing into Ukraine. The Kirovsky plant in Leningrad was cut off by the German siege. Soviet planners faced the prospect of losing their tank manufacturing capacity entirely. What followed was an evacuation of unprecedented scale. Entire factories were dismantled, loaded onto rail cars, and transported east to the Urals, beyond the reach of German forces. Skilled workers, engineers, machinery, dyes, tooling, and raw materials made the journey. The Stalin tractor factory in Chelyabinsk became known as Tankograd, Tank City, as it absorbed evacuated capacity from multiple plants and began churning out T-34s. The Dzerzhinsky Ural railcar factory at Nizhny Tagil became Factory 183, the heart of T-34 production. The city of Sverdlovsk absorbed machine shops fleeing the German advance. Even as these factories were being reassembled in their new locations, the Stalingrad tractor factory continued production through 1942, producing 40% of all T-34s during the critical period, even as the city itself became a battlefield. The production figures tell a story of industrial determination. In 1941, despite the chaos of the German invasion and the massive evacuation effort, Soviet factories produced over 2,000 T-34s. In 1942, production jumped to over 12,000. By 1943, the Soviet Union was producing T-34s at a rate of over 1,000 per month. By the end of the war, over 57,000 T-34s had been built, with total production eventually exceeding 84,000 when post-war production was included. To put this in perspective, Germany produced approximately 25,000 Panzer IVs, their most produced tank, during the entire war. They built around 6,000 Panthers and fewer than 2,000 Tigers. The total German tank production from 1939 to 1945 was under 20,000 vehicles. The Soviet Union produced nearly 3 times that number of T-34s alone, to say nothing of the KV series, AS series, light tanks, and self-propelled guns they also manufactured. The mathematics were stark and brutal. A German tank battalion might face Soviet tank formations 5 or 10 times larger. Even if German tanks were superior vehicle for vehicle, even if German crews were better trained, the numbers eventually overwhelmed these advantages. The T-34 might have been crude compared to a Panther, but if you could field 5 T-34s for every Panther, the crudeness became irrelevant. This numerical advantage was magnified by the design philosophy that made the T-34 what it was. Because it was relatively simple, battle damage could be repaired more easily. Because production was standardized across multiple factories, spare parts were more readily available. Because the design emphasized robustness over refinement, T-34s could be driven by crews with less extensive training and still be effective. German forces, meanwhile, struggled with an increasingly complex logistics situation. The Wehrmacht fielded a bewildering array of different tank types and variants, each requiring its own spare parts, each with its own maintenance needs. A unit might have Panzer IIIs, Panzer IVs, Panthers, Tigers, captured Soviet tanks pressed into German service, Czech tanks, assault guns, and various specialized vehicles. Keeping all of these different types supplied with parts and ammunition was a nightmare. The Soviet approach was the opposite. Build enormous numbers of one good enough design. Saturate the battlefield with T-34s. Accept that individual tanks would be lost, but ensure there were always more tanks to replace them. Train crews adequately, but not extensively, because replacement crews would be needed constantly. Focus industrial capacity on a few key designs rather than diversifying across many types. By 1944, this strategy was paying devastating dividends. Soviet offensives featured massed tank formations that simply crushed German defenses through weight of numbers. German units that knocked out dozens of Soviet tanks still found themselves overwhelmed by the survivors. After-action reports from German commanders increasingly reflected a tone of weary resignation. They could win tactical victories, destroy more enemy vehicles than they lost, but the tide of Soviet armor just kept coming. The production advantage also meant the Soviets could afford to lose tanks at rates that would have been catastrophic for Germany. Soviet tank losses throughout the war were enormous, running into tens of thousands of vehicles, but the factories kept building replacements. German losses, while lower in absolute numbers, represented a larger proportion of their total strength and were harder to replace. The final years. By January 1944, the strategic situation on the Eastern Front had fundamentally shifted. The Germans were in retreat along most of the front. The Soviets had liberated significant portions of occupied territory and were driving toward the pre-war borders. And the T-34, which had been such a shock in 1941, had evolved while remaining essentially the same vehicle. The most significant upgrade came in the form of the T-34-85, introduced in 1944. This variant featured a larger turret with an 85mm gun, addressing one of the T-34's main deficiencies. The original 76.2mm gun, while adequate against German medium tanks, struggled against the thick armor of Panthers and Tigers. The 85mm gun could penetrate a Panther's turret front at ranges up to 1,000 meters and could threaten even Tigers under the right conditions. The larger turret also allowed for a three-man crew arrangement, finally separating the roles of commander and gunner. This significantly improved the tank's combat effectiveness, allowing the commander to focus on tactical awareness while the gunner concentrated on engaging targets. Combined with improved optics and fire control, the T-34-85 was a far more capable fighting vehicle than its predecessor. But even the older 76mm versions remained deadly effective, not because of superior technology, but because of how they were employed. Soviet tank doctrine had evolved significantly since the chaotic early days of Barbarossa. By 1944, Soviet tank forces operated with a level of coordination and tactical sophistication that would have seemed impossible in 1941. Tank armies with hundreds or thousands of T-34s would coordinate massive breakthroughs, supported by artillery, air power, and infantry in combined arms operations that rivaled anything the Germans had achieved in their glory days. German forces attempting to stem these offensives found themselves in an impossible situation. Their defensive lines were thinly held, stretched across vast distances with insufficient forces. When Soviet tank spearheads broke through, there were rarely enough reserves to contain the penetration. German units would knock out T-34s by the dozens, only to be bypassed and encircled by other Soviet formations that simply drove around the defensive strongpoints. The long-range engagement advantages of Panthers and Tigers mattered less when Soviet tactics emphasized close-range urban fighting and exploitation of breakthroughs into the German rear. A Panther that could kill T-34s at 2,000 meters was less useful in the rubble of a city block where engagement ranges dropped to 50 meters. And in the fluid, fast-moving battles of 1944 and 45, mechanical reliability mattered more than theoretical performance. German tank crews found themselves fighting an increasingly desperate defensive war. Units that had once been the spearheads of victorious offensives were now scattered across the vast front, trying to plug gaps, counterattack breakthroughs, cover retreats. The confident predictions of 1941 seemed like artifacts from another age. By the spring of 1945, when the final Soviet offensives pushed into Germany itself, the T-34 had become a symbol of Soviet military might. Columns of these tanks, by now familiar to German soldiers through years of bitter experience, rolled through Polish and German cities, grinding toward Berlin. The crews manning them weren't the same poorly trained, poorly equipped tankers of 1941. These were veterans, experienced in coordinated operations, confident in their vehicles and their cause. The Germans still fielded some of the most technologically advanced tanks of the war. The Panther, with its problems largely resolved, was arguably the best medium tank design of World War II. The Tiger II, or King Tiger, was the most heavily armored and armed tank to see significant combat service. German assault guns and tank destroyers incorporated lessons learned through years of brutal fighting, but none of it mattered. Superior technology couldn't overcome the fundamental arithmetic of the Eastern Front. Legacy. When the war ended in May 1945, the T-34 stood as perhaps the single most influential tank design in history. It had forced the Germans to completely rebuild their Panzer arm. It had demonstrated that mass production of an adequate design could defeat smaller numbers of superior vehicles. It had proven that sloped armor, diesel engines, and wide tracks were the future of tank design. The influence of the T-34 extended far beyond the Soviet Union. Every major power studied the tank in detail after the war. American, British, and French designers incorporated lessons from the T-34 into their own post-war designs. The emphasis on sloped armor became universal. The T-34's influence can be traced through the design lineage of virtually every modern tank. For Germany, the encounter with the T-34 represented a strategic catastrophe. The necessity of responding to it consumed resources that might have been devoted to other weapon systems. The Panther and Tiger programs, while producing excellent vehicles, could never be manufactured in sufficient numbers to match Soviet production. The complexity these vehicles embodied, which made them so formidable in combat, also made them vulnerable to the industrial arithmetic of total war. The story of the T-34 is often told as a narrative of Soviet ingenuity and German defeat, but it's more nuanced than that. Soviet tank design in the 1930s was heavily influenced by Western ideas and even benefited from technology sharing with Germany before the war. The T-34 itself incorporated American suspension ideas and learned from Soviet experience with British and French tanks. What made it revolutionary wasn't that every feature was original, but that the combination of features was optimized for mass production and mass employment in a way no Western tank had been. The German response to the T-34 demonstrated both the strengths and weaknesses of German military culture. The engineering excellence that produced the Panther and Tiger represented genuine innovation. The tactical adaptations that allowed German forces to continue fighting effectively against superior numbers showed remarkable flexibility. But the inability to match Soviet production, the tendency toward over-engineering, and the fixation on technological superiority over practical effectiveness revealed fundamental flaws in German strategic thinking. The T-34 forced a complete reassessment of tank design across the world. Before 1941, tank doctrine emphasized a division between heavily armored infantry support tanks and lightly armored cruiser tanks. The T-34 proved you could have both speed and armor in a single design. It showed that clever engineering could achieve armor protection without excessive weight. It demonstrated that a relatively simple, robust design could be more strategically valuable than a more sophisticated one if you could build enough of them. For the German officers who had laughed at Soviet tank designs in the summer of 1941, the T-34 became an object lesson in the dangers of underestimating your opponent. The mockery with which they'd viewed Soviet engineering turned to respect, then to concern, and finally to a kind of weary acknowledgement that the Soviets had gotten something fundamentally right that the Germans had missed. The last T-34s didn't retire from frontline service until decades after World War II ended. Variations of the design saw combat in Korea, the Middle East, Africa, and various other conflicts around the world. Some remained in reserve service well into the 21st century. No other tank can claim such longevity or such widespread influence. When historians debate the weapons that changed World War II, the T-34 ranks among the most significant. Not because it was the most advanced tank of the war, it wasn't. Not because it was the most comfortable or the easiest to operate, it was neither. But because it represented a design philosophy that proved more strategically valuable than technological sophistication. It forced the Germans to rebuild their entire armored force in response to it. And it rolled into Berlin in the spring of 1945, a tangible symbol of how badly German intelligence had misjudged Soviet capabilities 4 years earlier. The German officers who encountered the T-34 on June 23, 1941, had their assumptions shattered by a tank they weren't supposed to face. Their laughter at Soviet engineering died somewhere in the fields of Western Russia, replaced by the sound of diesel engines and the crack of 76mm guns. The T-34 didn't just change the balance of armored warfare. It changed the entire course of World War II. If you enjoyed this deep dive into one of history's most significant weapon systems, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel for more stories from World War II that reveal the human and technological factors behind the conflict's most crucial turning points. The story of the Eastern Front is filled with moments where assumptions collided with reality, and the T-34 stands as one of the most dramatic examples of what happens when you underestimate your enemy.